Dr. Raymond. Good evening, dear attendees. We are happy to host today our learning session number 7 for the year 2023. Today we have special guest, Dr. Raymond Gervais, as a speaker. Dr. Raymond has 35 years of experience working as consultant from planning, monitoring in education, health, and infrastructure. Since 2018, he has working for MERIT program, enhancing resource management through institutional transformation, which is funded by Global Affairs Canada. We had privilege to work with Dr. Raymond at the discussion of the glossary of key terms in evaluation and results-based management, which was held in last March at Terelj, where Dr. Raymond was the facilitator. Today's presentation will take 30 minutes and we have 20 minutes for questions and answers. Now I would like to invite Dr. Raymond to give us the presentation.
Well, I'm very privileged to be amongst you. It's 8:00 a.m. in Montreal, so it was an early morning for me. But it's always a privilege to be able to discuss with my colleagues in evaluation. So we're going to look, and I will share the screen. We're going to look at how humanitarian interventions have a different deployment of evaluation processes and even criterias, so that people are aware of how in disaster there is a possibility of doing evaluations, but that flexibility is the key word, because there is and there are important differences. So let me share the screen here. Okay, share the screen. Here it is. Okay. Right. Sure. Okay. So the title is kind of enigmatic: objective and subjective perspectives. The reason being that we're going to look at 3 case studies, 2 of which I acted as an objective, or at least I attempted to be an objective evaluator, or in fact team leader for one of them. And the last one was more subjective because I wasn't an evaluator. I was a volunteer for the Canadian Red Cross. So this, let me put, okay, right, okay. So there has been a consensus. There is a consensus around the differences between an evaluation of development projects, programs, and humanitarian interventions. In our presentation, the objective is really to look at 3 case studies. Preliminary screens and discussion will be around the specific characteristics of humanitarian interventions and criteria, and how they differ, at least, you know, in good part, from development interventions, and therefore in development interventions evaluations. The 3 case studies are going to be 2 in Canada. One is the 2013 Alberta flood. The second one is in Quebec, in my region, in the Montreal region, and in fact it became provincial, as we will see. And the one in the middle is in Haiti, Haiti being a Caribbean country, where the American Red Cross had decided to fund and organize and implement a better life in my neighborhood, LAMICA, which is the Creole acronym, in 2014. Okay, now let's look the best, and this document will be made available to you in the Google Drive folder. The best organization in terms of humanitarian evaluation, monitoring and evaluation is ALPNA. ALPNA, sorry, Active Learning Network for Accountability and Performance. They are based in UK, and they have produced both a pilot guide and, which is actually a PDF version of a PowerPoint presentation, but also a 400-page guide on evaluation of humanitarian action. And some of the definitions and some of the ideas, let's be honest, come from that. Obviously, the case studies come from my own experience. The definition is interesting, and I've tried to put keywords in red. It's an action taken with the objective of saving lives, and that becomes the core, the center of what humanitarian actions are all about. Alleviating suffering and maintaining human dignity during and after human-induced crisis. So that includes conflicts, famines, natural disasters, as well as to prevent and prepare for them. And that small definition is so central in understanding what humanitarian interventions are and how different they can be from development intervention evaluations. The four phases, and this comes from the US Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA guidelines. The four phases include mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. So let's look at some of the information at this point in our presentation. There's at least four important points that require clarification. One is a notion of saving lives. It does constitute the heart of the humanitarian practices. However, it is double-edged sword. It is actually ambivalent in how it is perceived. It has its positive and negative sides. In a disaster, saving lives is and should be the ultimate goal. But when it's tainted with religious and political objectives, it may become a cause for implementation blindness and bias. And I could give a whole series of examples of organizations, whether religious or politically motivated, that have tried and often have been successful in depriving and not allowing an equal distribution of disaster relief. And so saving lives, although it's inherent to humanitarian interventions, may have a negative effect if it's not properly controlled and contextualized. And that's the role of monitoring and evaluation. And that's why saving lives, although it may be good, it may also be diverted. So the issue is not, should we save lives? We all agree this is important, but more, how many lives can we save with the appropriate implementation plan and absence of bias, offering an equal opportunity to access services. The humanitarian intervention, as is also the case in the health sector, where I've also worked, are notoriously difficult to evaluate because the objective of saving lives overshadows any unbiased assessment of the effectiveness. And let's put aside the notion of efficiency and keep focused on effectiveness. What really should be our preoccupation as monitoring agents or evaluation agents is to understand that it is important to save lives, but it's also important to save as many lives as possible. And that's something that often is forgotten. Okay, now, one of the important differences in humanitarian interventions are the criteria. I'll let you read. We have on the left side, we have the traditional development evaluation criteria: relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, impact, and sustainability. And then you have some that have been added. The only one that appears in the 2022 glossary is coherence, okay? Now, the second point I want to make about humanitarian intervention is, and if we go back to the previous screen, is that the end line phase of this type of intervention is recovery. Now, this is important to remember because it is, again, a difference vis-a-vis development intervention. A development intervention will try to create a before and after difference. In the case of humanitarian intervention, what is sought and what responsibility and accountability is given to disaster relief agencies or organizations is recovery, is bringing people back to a before situation, not more, okay? So the issue here is really a perspective of ex ante, of before the disaster. And so you have a situation where I was confronted in focus group discussions with people who had received temporary shelters to pull them away from the streets where they had to live during and after, in the days and weeks after the earthquake, the catastrophic earthquake. We'll talk about it in a minute. And when we did evaluations of these temporary shelter projects, some people would say, well, when will you build a brick house? Well, they didn't have a brick house before the earthquake. And there is often a minority of beneficiaries that expect that they will be in a better situation than they were prior to disaster. And the problem with that is that there is that notion that is inherent, again, to humanitarian intervention of what really is the objective is recovery. Now, the role, and we saw, let's go back to the, I'll try to get back to the previous screen. Previous, okay. No, previous. Okay, previous. Okay. The role of preparedness appears in two phases, mitigation and preparedness. This has become vitally important and generalized in humanitarian interventions. There is a lot of investment, and often more investment in preparedness than in recovery and response, actually. There is a lot of investment, human resources and funds in preparedness, because this is felt as being very important. Now, the definitions given by FEMA, the US, of preparedness, of mitigation, is defined as preventing, and I quote, preventing future emergencies or minimizing their effects. And according to FEMA, it includes any activities that prevent an emergency, reduce the chance of an emergency happening, and reduce the damaging effects of unavoidable emergencies. So mitigation is really, building infrastructure that would prevent communities of being exposed to unnecessary risks, or at least avoidable risk, or ones that we are aware of. Okay. Preparedness, as we see here, is more operational. And again, according to FEMA, preparedness is, preparing to handle emergency, and it's described as including plans and preparations made to save lives. Again, the notion of save lives and help response and rescue operations. Okay, so these are important points. As for the criteria, obviously these are not as well known to evaluators. And that's why I'm trying to have you to introduce them to you, because there are part of what you may find, and I have found, in requests for proposals when requesting evaluators for a humanitarian intervention. And if you look at the definitions, they are very, very specific to the two main types of evaluations in humanitarian interventions. One is accountability evaluations, the other one is learning evaluations. And that's an important point to make. In my experience, coordination, and I could give, again, a few examples, coordination is for me the most significant and most important, because it is, if it is followed, it is a way for all intervention organizations or agencies to achieve maximizing their contribution to disaster relief. Okay, so what does all of these two screens mean for an evaluation process? First of all, evaluators are placed in the difficult position of having to develop a more objective view of the saving lives processes by including analysis of how well this was achieved or not, and recommend ways of improving in an objective and acceptable manner. So again, the idea of saving lives, yes, but are we sure we did everything we could to save as many lives as possible? The three factors of monitoring and evaluation, time, costs, and complexity in humanitarian interventions are not balanced in the same way as when we're doing development interventions. Time is short, time is unpredictable. Planning a 5-year program, if you're using 1 year to prepare it, you have 1 year to prepare it. If a disaster strikes, like I was saying to Shimgi, last week we got a nice storm that put 1 million households in danger because they had no electricity, in relative danger, because they had no electricity for between 3 to 6 days. Okay, now that was a minor situation. Nevertheless, when a disaster strikes, there is very little time. The same for costs. The allocation of costs, allocation of funds becomes an important issue, and often is a topic of questioning by beneficiaries. And obviously, the complexity in a disaster situation, the complexity is linked to training. And as we'll see in at least one or two of these examples, training becomes an important part. Nevertheless, because of time and the complexity, training is not given as much time as required, and therefore monitors fall victim to a lack of training. Data gathering operations during an evaluation are rigged with pitfalls linked to what is perceived as unmet expectations by some. Evaluators must weigh these expressions of dissatisfaction and come to evidence-based findings and conclusion as to the agency's performances. Obviously, when you're an evaluator and you are circulating, as I did during the multiple evaluations I did after the earthquake in Haiti, some of the stuff I did in West Africa, and the work I did in Canada, you have people saying, you know, why are you not giving me more? When in fact, the mandate of the agency, the organization, is not to give more, is to give enough for people to recover. And that's different from giving more in relationship to what they had before. And finally, the last point on this is because of the recognized importance of preparation in all its forms, more attention must be allocated to ex-ante, before measures, plans, and training than in a development program. And if you're an evaluator, often, as is often the case, you have to do more than a situation analysis or look at a situation analysis, as would be the case for development intervention. You have to look at codes, you have to look at preparations that may have occurred years and often decades before. Let me give you a very small example. In Haiti, after the earthquake, it was made clear that the building code had not been modified in 25 years. Now, if you are evaluating something, and this was my case, you have to take into account something that was done 25 years ago and something that was not done in the 25 years between the last version of the building code and the disaster, so that your evaluation in such an intervention requires that you take into account things that may have been done or not done decades before the disaster. Okay, so let's see through our three examples. The first example is Alberta, the 2013 Alberta floods. I was called in by the Canadian Red Cross as an evaluator, although, to be quite honest, I didn't go to the field. I was asked in my request for a proposal, I was asked to be advisor, evaluation advisor, survey advisor, and analyst. Okay, so I analyzed all the data that had been produced during the Canadian Red Cross intervention. I'll let you read all of the information. Please look carefully at the evaluation questions. They are really good questions. They're very intelligent questions. And the evaluation advisor in the head office of the Canadian Red Cross was a very competent evaluator with whom collaboration was a plus, because she knew what she was talking about. There were many sub-questions, but it was clear there was a structure, and the importance was given to the main questions, okay? The criterias, look carefully, relevance, appropriateness. Often appropriateness is used in humanitarian evaluation RFPs instead of relevance, but they're kind of synonymous. Look at coordination, the importance of coordination, as I pointed out to you a few minutes ago. Okay. What were the strengths of the Canadian Red Cross, the Alberta section of the Canadian Red Cross, and the head office? The Alberta Red Cross could count on the total support of the National Canadian Red Cross office. Though the disaster plans could not adequately deal with these conditions, and you will understand the reason in a minute, the existence of a well thought through plan. The problem in Alberta is that there had never been in the history of Alberta such a disaster. And therefore, the plans that were built on the notion of average did not apply. We were confronted with an unusual series of circumstances, enormous floods covering enormous territory. So though the plans were good, they were not adequate. Nevertheless, they laid the ground for actions and adapted strategies. So they were not totally up to dealing with this incredible situation, but they were there and they were functional and they had been revised and updated. The reaction was timely, with evacuation orders issued on the evening, June the 20th, on the evening when the flood started. which is why you only had a mortality of 4 people. There was only 4 deaths recorded for this tragedy. Reporting on the situation in this Canadian Red Cross system began on a daily basis the day after the flood started. The daily reports came out the day after the flood started. The shelters were put in place. There were 16 shelters during that phase. The recovery phase was given funds and human resources for years after the events. So the recovery really took into consideration the fact that, you know, what people had before had to be taken into account, so that for years the communities were given grants by the Canadian Red Cross through the appeal money that had been brought in, and individuals were also given recourse. The weaknesses, though, and you will see them here in the lessons learned. The weaknesses, and please, you'll see the Google Drive folder has the findings in the presentation. We did a debriefing presentation, actually a long PowerPoint presentation for the Canadian Red Cross in Ottawa, and that file will be in the Google Drive folder. The weakness is that the monitoring system implemented did not give an appropriate picture of the situation. In many cases, because training, the notion of training and control of the monitoring agents were inadequate. So there was a plan to monitor. It did not work. And in fact, we came to the conclusion through the data that I analyzed for the report that it was not appropriate, did not give a proper picture of human resources mobilized, of people that were registering. And as I will say in a minute, the registration system, in fact, itself was not adequate. Silo structures between stakeholders, the federal government, the provincial government, the municipal government, and the First Nations, because that flooded region had an important First Nations of natives, Canadian natives, living in those regions. And so there was a silo of different authorities, which explains the rise, the line of command became very blurry during the intervention. The client, and what they call client is actually the victim's registration system, was deemed a failure by key informants. And that's an important element, is that registration, as I didn't give you the data, but it is in the report, registration was not done through use of computers. Registration was in fact done by the calling centers that had been put in place by the Canadian Red Cross. So people were being registered, but the self-registration system failed. Okay. Now, what's important here is the most significant finding. You may not, well, probably don't have it here. Here in red, the notion of perceptions. Okay. Now, this is very interesting because the year before 2013, in 2012, I had been team leader for doing an evaluation of the American Red Cross support to the cholera epidemic in Haiti, because right after the earthquake, there had been a cholera epidemic. Okay. And so among many others, the American Red Cross brought in support and different interventions in their portfolio. During that evaluation, in a focus group discussion, when I raised the issue of, okay, this will be the end of this project by the American Red Cross because the epidemic is under control and the deaths are going down, the mortality is going down. How do you feel? And the reaction was quite interesting and informed me, was well, we know that it had to finish, but you were beside us. And they said it in Creole, which was very moving. You were beside us, meaning that you supported us, you were there. And so the perception, the non-material, though they knew that, you know, they would lose the material aspects of presence, their memories would be, and their perceptions of American Red Cross was that they would be there. And so when we going back to the Alberta, the notion of perception was not in their draft version of the questionnaire. And so I turned around and I said, listen, maybe we should have questions of asking the victims how they perceive the Canadian Red Cross presence in the flooded areas beyond the material aspect. And that brought really quite interesting results. For me, the most significant finding in our analysis was the notion of perceptions of the subjective importance of Canadian Red Cross's presence in affected neighborhood. 90% of surveyed affected population felt that the Red Cross presence was, one question, reassuring, provided comfort, and gave a sense of hope. And this is not material. This is just people saying to others, you were there, we saw you, we knew we could count on you. From an evaluation perspective, it must rebalance the scale between the material and non-material as presence is perceived as a positive contribution to response. It was true for Haiti and it was true for Alberta. Second case. Okay, I'm not going to read all of this. You can read it. The PowerPoint will be put in the folder. Will be put in the folder. You will see both the PowerPoint, and then I think I put the whole report for this. Okay, this is the case is a recovery program in the aftermath of the Haiti earthquake of 2012. 10, sorry. Now, the preliminary note is that it was a failure. I was team leader and I failed. That was the only case in my 35 years of consultancy that I failed. And you will understand some of the reasons for this, and they're already here. Please look at evaluation data sources, key informant interviews, a health statistical survey, and a 52-question evaluation matrix, 52 questions. Okay, so there were multiple reasons for which I failed, and obviously when I went back to my notes and to my report, I was not particularly proud, and it was not a really interesting moment in my preparation of this presentation, I have to admit. What were the few, and there are not many, strengths of the American Red Cross in this quasi and perceived by many as being development intervention by the American Red Cross in a Port-au-Prince neighborhood? The American Red Cross was a first respondent given the proximity and American presence in the hours that followed the earthquake. So they had a comparative advantage from, say, the International Red Cross, for example. The second one was that the MEA program, this is the program we're talking about, had been planned in 2012. Please remember the date, in 2012, by a high-level expert of Belgian origin, whom I had the privilege of meeting, who had extensive experience in the sector. Though she was not there in 2014, she was there in my previous work with the American Red Cross. So I had an opportunity to talk to her way before I was recruited to do the evaluation of the neighborhood program. Let's look quickly at the lists, and I will give you here the overall findings while I talk about the weaknesses. Weaknesses. The implementation had not reached an evaluable level. Before issuing a request for a proposal, an evaluability analysis should have been done. In fact, the three pillars that I think I described here, the three pillars were, oh, wait a minute, maybe they're on the previous screen. Here, let me. Okay. Yeah, social empowerment was pillar 1, economic strengthening, pillar 2, which was actually small, medium-sized development of enterprise, and pillar 3 was physical renewal, which was exact reconstruction. And actually, the objective was to rebuild houses, to rebuild brick houses, actually. So these three pillars, actually, only the first one was in part implemented when we were asked to do a midterm evaluation. The two others had nothing, basically nothing. In the case of pillar 3, the summary statement is that the bulldozers had just arrived. There was 0 houses rehabilitated or rebuilt. Okay, and then for pillar, the weak monitoring system was a characteristic of pillar 1. And in fact, in the case of pillar 1, I would ask people who had gone through, business development training, which actually I'm not questioning the training. I never questioned the training itself, but in the end, I was faced as an evaluator, sitting in front of someone and asking what was the impact of the funds they had received, to which I was replied, we got the funds last week. There's nothing to evaluate in this situation. Okay. Now, the implementation was not there. That was not clear in the request for proposal. So in effect, we were kind of co-opted in doing something that was not to be evaluated and had no evaluation potential. Although the evaluation expert, in this case, I'm the one, of the team had recommended not to submit a proposal based on the RFP. And obviously, an RFP with 52 questions is not a serious RFP. The firm had more interest in the mandate's contribution to its revenues. The advisor, the MEA advisor for the American Red Cross, was a statistician with no previous understanding of what monitoring was or how to perform an evaluation. This had been made clear in the RFP. Now, if you go through some of the documents, some of the codes and guidelines that we have in humanitarian practice, one of them is called People in Aid Code of Good Practice. I quote, "The staff of a humanitarian agency, both nationally and internationally recruited, are a key determinant of the success or failure of a humanitarian intervention. Yet, the human resource component of humanitarian action is rarely given much attention in disaster humanitarian interventions, except when there are obvious problems." That was also true, another weakness, of the person that replaced the planner of this project. During one year, they had brought in an American manager for the LAMICA program who literally had done nothing, had set the whole program on hibernation where no activity had been done, which explains why 2 of the 3 pillars had no activities or actions to be evaluated. There may have been disagreement in the American Red Cross headquarters between factions. In the American Red Cross, I knew from previous experience that there was a Republican faction and there was a Democrat faction, as strange as it may seem. that was the situation. It may explain why there was such a delay. The sectoral expert who had been mobilized by the Canadian firm, that's the firm I was working for, he was also contracted by that firm, had neither the expertise in evaluation nor the professionalism to deliver an acceptable contribution to the report. In effect, he arrived one day late and left one day early because he had more important hockey games to participate in than doing his job as a sector expert for the evaluation mission. And then finally, the monitoring was very weak in pillar 1 and non-existent in pillars 2 and 3. The program reports, and you see that here, overall the LAMICA is found to be missing the most important. The program reports did not offer hints of how integration was to be achieved. The most significant finding was the validation of American Red Cross senior staff's fears that they could not implement a program with such a development focus, not having the experience, the expertise, and field knowledge to succeed. In fact, they knew from the get-go, because they had never done that before, that doing a development intervention would not be successful. Okay, this is the last case study, and let's be quite brief because I'm overstepping your questions. If you want to read this, okay, let me contextualize this. As I said, I did not evaluate. I was a volunteer. I was part of the staff. I was part of the people. I was a team leader for people who were on the phone, phoning victims of COVID with who had just been given an order of going into quarantine and therefore subject to eventually side effects of the quarantine itself. So I wasn't an evaluator. I was a volunteer. And the question is, can an evaluator lose his perspective when he or she decides to do volunteer work? And that's where it gets interesting. The strengths of the Canadian Red Cross in this support to quarantined households was that there was an incredibly competent team of agents, team leaders, and coordinators. There was 2 coordinators working for this program, which lasted many months, actually. Detailed training on the approach, on the questionnaire, on the service delivery protocols, and eventually the potential follow-ups with 2 other services that were offered. One was special support, and the other one was psychological counseling for individuals that felt very stressed. All of that had been put in place. And there was what had been corrected from the previous Alberta experience. There was a robust management information system, although, as I knew, it was very complex to use. What would an evaluator offer as comments concerning this case 3? The weaknesses was that there was no timely communication strategy to help mobilize frontline health personnel. The constraint on sources of relevant information at the local level were important. Community organizations could not be involved in referrals, and there was ultimately a low efficiency rate. The risk analysis from the get-go, from that first meeting where I, as a practicing evaluator, said to the coordinators that the risk was that if you didn't bring in the frontline personnel in the referral system that would feed the program, that would feed us, names and phone numbers of people that should and could have been vulnerable was not in place. And that was the greatest, most important failure, weakness of the program. The stakeholder analysis, and look at all the keywords. The keywords link to our work as evaluator. Risk analysis, stakeholder analysis, communication, efficiency, analysis, feedback. All of this is part of what we do. And my conclusion to this presentation to say, we don't lose that when we change the work we're doing. We have to keep it. My concluding remark is, for me, the most significant finding from my experience as a volunteer, not as an evaluator, but as a volunteer, was that an evaluator does not lose easily his or her specific analytical skills. In this case, insights by an evaluator were validated by the challenges of the deployment of the program. Logical conclusion is that inviting planners, senior managers, and elected officials to train in monitoring and evaluation allows them to acquire perspectives and capabilities they may not master yet. And in fact, you know, my greatest, in this case, my greatest, let's say, sadness is that a lot of what I tried to transfer in terms of expertise was not taken into account. Though, if you look at the real-time analysis, I was really happy to go into analyzing the data from the management information system and giving feedback to the meeting at the coordinator's suggestion. And the reaction was very positive. And one said, when I'm involved in these operations, these Red Cross operations, best case scenarios, we're told at the end of what all of this meant, you are giving that to us in the middle of what we're doing. And that's, for us, very important. Thank you. Oh, there it is. Right now. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you, Dr. Raymond. Now let's start the question and answers part. Dear attendees, please feel free to ask your questions, or you can type in the chat section directly. Please unmute before asking the questions. Unmute the microphone.
Hey, Dr. Raymond, thank you very much for your very innovative, informative presentations on humanitarian evaluations, which are not really common topic for many of us. And I really liked how you distinguished what's the traditional OECD DAC criteria and what's the humanitarian criteria, that coordination, etc. Like, as I remember, during COVID, we had quite many evaluation meetings were announcing to see how COVID is impacting the households, and also some shock responsive. The government has some shock responsive intervention to herders and herders in rural areas. So I'm not so sure if I haven't read any of the reports yet, but now I can have this lens when I read those types of reports. And my question is, like, I was listening to some COVID-related evaluations from, I think it was some UNICEF and some other UN regional webinars. They were mentioning about like, usually all these international organizations set a reference group to check and balance the quality of evaluation reports and methods. But because of this humanitarian situation, they don't have those reference groups set up. Also, they reduce many of the bureaucratic, or let's say, right, those steps because it's emergency and we don't have this luxury to go through all the steps. So I was wondering, especially for the two humanitarian evaluations you are involved in, the first two humanitarian, did they have reference group, and did you notice any of some reduction of barriers of all the components of classic evaluation?
No, we didn't. And in fact, the issue, the biggest, most important issue and constraint is, now you're talking about experimental evaluation. You're talking about experimental evaluation with a control group, with a reference group. It's called reference group or control group. But in both cases, obviously, what you can use in a laboratory
I made it maybe wrong, like reference group meaning some external validators of the report, not the control and like.
Okay. No, we didn't have a reference. You know, in any case, it would, in the case of Haiti, it would have been to no purpose because the MEA advisor was so weak in evaluation that he wouldn't have understood, you know, what was going on anyway. He didn't actually, because, you know, it's not that I want to blast or, you know, I want to blast the MEA, but he was not someone that was good to work with simply because he didn't have the expertise. When I, you know, talked about the weakness of the monitoring system, his remark was to say, well, there's no really use in monitoring because we can do surveys. Because he couldn't understand the difference between, you know, monitoring and doing surveys. Survey is a statistical operation, and that was his field of expertise. But in our field, as you know, monitoring is a vital core function. We didn't have any reference because the level of these evaluations were not to the point of, we're not oriented towards the types of things we find in the health sector. And having reference, not necessarily reference groups, but having reference evaluators or assessment processes are what you find in the health sector. But in people acting in the development or the classic humanitarian, you don't necessarily have that. But in the case of COVID, obviously it was vitally important. What we would call a meta-evaluation in certain sense would have been interesting. And I think it's probably being done now as we speak. Any other questions?
Can I have a question?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. My name is Butler Nyamatan. I'm intern from the YEA's internship program. And can you share an example of particularly successful evaluation of humanitarian intervention and what made it successful?
I'd have to think about it. I'd have to look at my CV and I'm sure. Well, okay. Let me. Okay. Now that you've brought me and bringing back memories. Okay. What I would consider. Okay. How do you define a successful evaluation? Would you want the intervention to be good, or do you want the evaluation report to be good? Which one do you want?
The first one.
Which is the intervention?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the I think I did 3 or 4 evaluation of temporary shelters in Haiti after the earthquake.
Mhm.
I was very active after the earthquake. And to be quite honest, my first, and goes back to the point Shimge was stating, that it's not usual. My experience before the earthquake in Haiti was doing development evaluations for development interventions. Haiti, I did portions of it in food aid, okay, but Haiti was the one where I did a lot, and I can refer to that. Among the 4 evaluations that I did of temporary shelters, I would say that at least 3 of them were good. Now, let's think about, okay, let's reflect on this. Temporary shelters were brought in because there was probably about 250,000 people living in the streets after the earthquake. Okay, so use your imagination and try to understand what chaotic situation is created by having 250,000 people in the streets. There were issues of rape, of laundering, of robbery, and in fact, that all came out in the focus group discussions that I had with victims of the earthquake. Okay, now bringing people back into the shelters made sure they were secure. And 3 out of the 4 were actually very successful because they offered adapted sanitary conditions with proper toilets, restrooms, and the shelters themselves. Okay, so that being said, then you have the political, and that's why it's important to understand the whole picture rather than simply a portion of it. Because of the political culture in Haiti, which has a specific name to it, it's called marronnage. The accountability, the notion of accountability is not part of the political thinking in Haiti. It may seem strange, but it's now something that is widely recognized and has been thoroughly analyzed. And I can say as a witness that I've seen the effects and the impact of that. Going back to our temporary shelters, the American Red Cross, the Canadian Red Cross, the International Federation of Red Crosses were heavily involved in building, having these shelters built. And they did it very effectively, very efficiently in most cases. And they did it disregarding the corruption at the customs office in Haiti, disregarding the fact, again, an important example of marronnage, the fact that the government of Haiti never answered clearly what type of shelter they were ready to offer their population. There was never an answer to that question. So years later, though the evaluation reports, most of them were positive, because the organizations, the NGOs that were building these shelters had wide experiences in Turkey, in Pakistan, in all regions where there had been major earthquakes and such events. Years later, the government of Haiti turned around and said that, in fact, that was not the model. The model of the shelters that were built by the NGOs and by the agencies were not that was, let's say, privileged or thought of by the government of Haiti. And so you have a situation where political, let's say, a problem of general governance and political squabbling prevented an operation of having the success it should have, and it had, in fact. were it not for political interventions later in the process. That makes an interesting point for an evaluator.
I have a question. My name is Sakharil, and I'm a participant of this Young and Emerging Evaluators. And I would like to thank you a lot for this lecture. And it was really truly beneficial for me to understand the perspective humanitarian intervention. And what I'm about to ask is that participating in humanitarian events and being a part of this is sometimes considered as really chaotic and uncertain. And how do you define focus and concentration, and how we can be more focused on what we are doing?
Okay, let me understand your question. Are you talking about participating in humanitarian actions or evaluating humanitarian actions?
When doing both things, how we can be more focused on what we are doing and what we are participating?
Well, you know, my suggestion is biased because of the training I've done. What is striking and what is positive in humanitarian interventions is the considerable number, the enormous body of codes, of guidelines, of guidance, of examples of interventions and of lessons learned of these interventions in the last, 40 or 50 years, okay? By referring to them, you are pushing forward a proactive, a relevant contribution to guiding the decision makers. That doesn't guarantee this will happen, because case 3 that I illustrated, and I had, very, very friendly, I mean, we made a very good team, and the problem which I voiced, and people were receptive, because Canadian Red Cross is a receptive organization. They were receptive, but what they did was too late. But having the possibility of opening the perspective of decision makers to the need to refer to previous experience, to guidelines, the codes, and making sure that all of these elements are in place. Case 3 is a perfect example of what happens when it's not done. The adjustments that I saw between the Alberta floods and the most recent experience I had last week of the management information system database at the Canadian Red Cross is a perfect example of being successful. There's 2 things that I'm proud of in that mandate, is the fact that I did convince people to look at the issues of perceptions, of getting, and there are actually 2 articles in the folder, in the Google Drive folder on that, the bringing in the concept of the non-material aspect of the visibility of the presence of the Canadian Red Cross in interventions as an element of response. The second is the fact that it became clear in the evaluation of the Alberta to 2013 that the management information system was not in place, and that's been corrected. So there are chances that you won't be heard, and there are chances that you will be heard. The important thing for you is to be as clear-minded as possible in what are the guidelines, what are the codes, what do we know about humanitarian interventions? And we know a lot. There's a lot that we know. The issue is getting the message out. Sometimes we're successful, and sometimes we're not. Does that answer your question?
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay. So it's 9:00 p.m. in your country. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm starting my day. Sorry.
No, it's okay. More questions? I'm asking this.
Okay.
And Raymond, would you like to mention that you are kindly, generously sharing your virtual library with our members and those attending today for the learning session?
Yes, yes. No problem. I put together a whole series of documents some in Mongolian, the rare documents that have been, thanks to my colleague Digi from MERIT, some in Mongolian, most of them in English, on monitoring, evaluation, results-based management, and humanitarian intervention. The presentation, the speaking notes that I was reading, I usually don't read, I usually improvise, but I said to myself I needed to not improvise this time and read some stuff that I wrote. The speaking notes will be uploaded in the next few minutes. And the ALNAP guides are both guides, the draft guide, was it the pilot guide, and then the latest version of the guide are already in the folder. So you have a whole series of documents in the folder, the FEMA guidelines, and 2 articles on the less material aspects, what they call socio-psychological aspects of disasters and humanitarian interventions are in the Google Drive. So please, you're going to be sending that to all of the members?
Yes.
Good. Then you have my permission to use it. And actually, I thought I would have it open until the 16th of April, but I'll leave it open until the 1st of May. Okay?
Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay. So if any other question from the audience? If not, maybe Hassa, you can close it.
Okay.
Does your daughter have a question?
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
So that's the end of the question and answers part of the session. Thank you very much, Dr. Raymond. On behalf of Mongolian Evaluation Association and all the attendees, we learned a lot on objective, subjective perspectives on humanitarian interventions. We really appreciate you for sharing with us your wealth of knowledge and expertise. And thank you, the attendees, for joining us tonight. And at the end, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Hassan Ben. I'm a member of Mongolian Evaluation Association and chair of Knowledge Task Force. So if you, any of the new members and attendees who are interested in contributing yourself in development of the knowledge related to monitoring and evaluation, so it's sharing and dissemination, please welcome to join our team. So again, thank you, Dr. Raymond and the attendees. We'll post the recording of the session on our Facebook page with free access. And sorry, Dr. Raymond, you want to say something? Okay,
no, just thank you and good luck, please. Good luck. I'm hoping the best for the association.
Thank you. Goodbye. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.